Come and sit down. Young lady, you're delaying everything. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to my third lecture, the third part of a trilogy. They were meant to all run in sequence, one after the other, but because my head of school, our head of school, your head of school was going to be in India today, I think, or wherever, not India, somewhere out there, I had to swap with him. So you've had two of me, and then a long gap of probably about 6 weeks, and then you're getting the third bit. And I hope you'll be able to tie it in with what you've heard before. I also would recommend you to go to this evening's lecture, because as Patrick said rather nicely, he is a graduate of Liverpool, and he, how do you put it, became a good architect. Like the two are completely unrelated. It might even happen to you. So there's a challenge, isn't it? Okay, less is more. American architecture after modernism. What's not happening? We're only on this one, are we? Just click it here quick. Oh, thank you. October the 4th, 1957. There are some dates in post-war history that are enormously significant, and this is one. You probably have never heard of this. I mean, you might have. But it was a day that really shook the American public, really alarmed them. Because on the 4th of October 1957, the Russians put the first satellite into space. America, after the Second World War, saw itself really as the world-leading nation. The Russians were there, but they were number two if they were anywhere. And suddenly, the Russians had pulled a fast one on the Americans and got the first satellite into space. So began the space race. And Sputnik really is the symbol, the starting gun for this. And I use it at the beginning of this lecture because I want to try to bring home to you the atmosphere of the time. The Cold War was heating up, or was it getting colder? However you wish to describe that. You guys with your computers open, why are you looking at those screens? Would you not prefer this? Can you tell me? I find it very odd. Yes, you. You. Are you not looking at me, or are you looking at something else altogether? You're talking to your girlfriend, or you're looking at this? It's sort of disconcerting, if not somewhat rude. I mean, I'm very happy that you have that on your computer, but I'd like to lecture to you instead of, you might as well go home and watch it on your TV. So it was something was happening at this time. The Cold War was heating up, if cold can get hot. And by 1961, as you will see, the Berlin Wall had been built. And it's really in this febrile atmosphere that we find a new type of architecture beginning to emerge. The Russians celebrated their launch of Sputnik with stamps, the sort of thing we do. Every other day there's a new stamp. There'll be one for Meghan and Harry, no doubt. And, well, we might celebrate that. Anyway, this was important. And very soon, the Cold War was in full flood. The Cold War, for those of you who don't know about European history, was this standoff between what we call the West, the principal Western powers, Britain, France, and America, and the East, which we essentially describe as Russia, but it included all those countries in Eastern Europe that Russia had taken over in the Second World War or come to control. The most obvious example of this was Germany, which was cut down the middle. And the most sensitive part of Germany, Berlin, the old capital, was quite literally cut down the middle. Berlin, after the end of the Second World War in 1945, was divided into four parts. The British part, the French part, the American part, and the Russian part. And then in 1948, I think it was, the Russians closed off any connection between Berlin and West Germany. Germany had been split, as I say. Berlin was a satellite town within East Germany. There was a corridor, an Autobahn, going from Berlin to a place called Helmstadt on the border between East and West Germany. And the East Germans closed this off, or the Russians, if you like, closed this off. And this was, very, very much a problem. So how did the West deal with this? Well, the first thing they did was really to combine. French, English, and Americans said, okay, we won't split our part of the city into three parts, we'll just call it the Western Zone, and we will do everything we can to support the people of Berlin who are living in that area. And something quite remarkable called the Berlin Airlift started up, and it went on for a number of months. And these were, it was literally an airlift. Aeroplanes were sent from the west, from German airports, West German airports, into Berlin with everything that was needed to keep the city alive, from food to coal to machine parts to or whatever a city needs to survive for a year or so. Planes were landing at a rate of something like 1 every 2 minutes. It was that intense. And that was late 1940s. Then, well, the Cold War continued through the 50s. People were leaving East Germany, leaving East Berlin, going to, or escaping really, to the West. And then the East German authorities decided they would have enough of that, and they built the Berlin Wall, which you can see here. It's not quite like the Great Wall of China, but the principle was the same. You weren't allowed to cross it. And if you tried to cross it, you would be shot. As simple as that. So here's the Berlin Wall going up, and it just cut through the city. It cut houses in half, it cut families in half, and it remained until 1989. Or was it 88? 89. And it's an enormously significant symbol of oppression of the Cold War, really, and those of us who lived through that will never forget it. So we have, the two big Western powers now, America and Russia. France and England, or France and Britain, I should say, were sort of there, but, by comparison, were very small. There was this president in the United States, John F. Kennedy, who was elected in 1960, charismatic, young, good-looking, war hero. And there was this older man, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Russian premier, the president, who had a similar war history. He'd been sent to really sort out the siege of Leningrad, this horrendous siege on the Volga River, the Russian town of Leningrad, that had been besieged by the Germans for a number of months. It was a really terrible battle during the Second World War, and he was sent as a general down there to resolve it, which he succeeded in doing, and the Germans were eventually defeated. So he was, in a way, a great war hero in Russia. He became the premier, not immediately after Stalin, but I think there was one guy in between them. So we have the East and the West represented by these two particular men, and here they are having a chat, a friendly chat. The friendliness wasn't always there. There was something in 1962 called the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Russians put missiles, long-range missiles, on the island of Cuba, which is in the Caribbean or the Caribbean Sea, just off Miami. just off Florida, in the southern part of the United States. And this was perceived as a huge threat to America, that the communist country, which was Cuba, under Fidel Castro, could actually provide a starting point for another world war. These missiles were placed there. And I think many people at that time thought the Third World War was about to start, and it would be, of course, a nuclear war. It didn't start, and it's largely due to the fact that these two men managed to talk to each other, as opposed to just press buttons and blow everybody to smithereens. So we, I suppose, can be very grateful for that. We are now in a situation, if you listen to the news, where there is an American president who is perhaps not quite as flexible or as well-informed as John F. Kennedy, and I think it's probably a very dangerous time in which we're living right now. If there was an architecture of this time, I think it was an architecture which somehow suggested the new post-war world of the space race. And I use this as a particular example. Eero Saarinen, the TWA, the Trans World Airlines terminal at JFK Airport, John Fitzgerald Kennedy Airport. It wasn't called JFK Airport when it was built. It was called Idlewild, and it was later named after JF Kennedy. He, of course, I will go back, the president there, JF Kennedy, he was assassinated in November 1963, so he actually didn't have a very long time as president. But the architecture that comes out of this time, I think if one is going to look at anything and say, is this an architecture of the Cold War, is this an architecture of the space race, it is this sort of architecture, the architecture that suggests travel, that suggests movement, that suggests velocity. And here we have a building of reinforced concrete, but an extraordinarily emotive building, a building full of curves, of forms, of movement, and I think a really rather fascinating piece of architecture. It's now closed, as most of these interesting buildings are, and probably been replaced by a large box. But I was fortunate enough to be changing planes at JFK one day, maybe 20 years ago, when I had about 3 hours of nothing to do. So I just wandered down from the British Airways terminal, which was the most horrendous, uninteresting piece of architecture, to this one that was just down the road, and spent about an hour here having a look around and sitting, as you see in the bottom left-hand photograph, in a gallery above the foyer, having a coffee and watching the building in use. It is something really beautiful about this. It's a building which suggests movement, suggests flight, suggests birds taking off. And we find a few buildings of this time with this sort of metaphorical allusion. It's a building of hope, perhaps. You might think this is extreme. What's a building of hope? A building that shows that maybe there's something better, something we can look forward to. 1956, the war was over just 10 years, 11 years before. America had rebuilt. It was still fairly grim in Europe. Britain had only just come out of rationing. I mean, as a child, a small child, I had a ration book, post-war ration book. You know, food was not that available. So an architecture of hope, an architecture perhaps of freedom, an architecture of excitement, of movement, an architecture of reinforced concrete. Eero Saarinen, an architect whose father was Finnish, who had come over, his name was Eliel, E-L-I-E-L Saarinen. His father had come over from Finland and became head of the Cranbrook Academy of Art up near Detroit in Michigan. And Eero was trained there, the son. They were both extremely talented architects. Eliel, I should say, the father, in a sense, from the arts and crafts tradition, Northern European, a lot of wood, brick, a very sensitive architecture, an architecture using materials in an expressive way. His son, much more to do with modern materials or contemporary materials, an architecture of the time, or even a future architecture. He did a very limited number of buildings because he actually died quite young, but the buildings he did are all just somewhat different. He didn't really have a style. Every building he did was for that particular purpose, for that moment. In 1947, there was a competition to build a memorial arch in St. Louis in Missouri. Missouri is right in the middle of the country. It's where the Mississippi River, has the Mississippi River running through it. It goes right down to the Gulf of Mexico. Missouri, on the west side of the Mississippi, is the first state, if you're moving west, that was part of the great Louisiana land purchase. When the young American states in a federal, working as a federal conglomeration, bought from the French government the whole of the Louisiana area, which went from New Orleans on the south coast, on the Gulf of Mexico, right up the center of the United States. The purpose of this was, from the French point of view, to provide extra money so they could continue their war against Britain. Now, you might think this is 1946. It isn't. We're talking about 1810 or so, 1812. The Louisiana Purchase, it was Napoleon, the French emperor, who sold this great French landholding to the Americans, and it's known as the Louisiana Purchase. And it was to be celebrated in 1947 by the building of a monument, an open competition, and both Eero Saarinen and his father, Elio Saarinen, entered the competition, and this is the building that won it. However, the judges misunderstood. They thought this was the building designed by the father, so they sent a letter to Elio Saarinen and said, well done, your building has won the competition. And it turned out not to be his building at all. It turned out to be his son's building, completely separate entry. They got their Saarinens mixed up, which I think says something about the potential of the younger Saarinen. So it's a big, big arch. It's concrete. It is hollow. You can get inside it and get in a capsule and go right up to the top. Now, here is a piece of space-age architecture. And I don't mean the arch, I mean the capsule. If you go there, and if they haven't replaced it with something newer, you'll find yourself getting into a cylindrical container. And you can get just about 2 people on one side and 2 on the other, and your knees are nearly knocking across the central space. And it's on a chain. And somebody pushes a button or pulls a lever, and this thing rattles up, and you go up and up and up and up and up till you get to the very top. It's like being in some sort of space capsule designed in the 1950s. And, this is absolutely the architecture of the time. So you can sort of relive the experience of the space race, if you like, by being inside this little capsule. And when you get to the top, there's a big gallery that cuts across the top of the arch with small porthole windows. And because it's an arch, the floor of the gallery rises up and goes down. You can't fall down the leg of the arch, don't worry about that. But it's not exactly flat. And you stand on a platform on either side, and you can look out west or you can look out east. And if you look out west, you're looking out over the city of St. Louis. What comes from St. Louis that's very famous? In a can that can make you drunk. Budweiser beer. Have you heard of Budweiser? Has anyone heard of Budweiser? Well, I'm none the wiser. Okay. So you can get your Budweiser beer in St. Louis. Do you know about Budweiser beer? It came from the Czech Republic. Here we have this American beer that is based upon a Czech beer. And then they tried to ban the Czechoslovak beer makers, brewers, from using the word Budweiser, because it had now become part of the sort of American capitalist society. Anyway, that case got thrown out. So you're looking out west. You can see the Budweiser Stadium, where they play baseball and so on. You can see the state capitol. There's this rich, sophisticated city spreading out towards the west. You get on the other side and you look east, and you're looking out across the Mississippi River into Illinois, the state of Illinois. And East St. Louis is a dump. It is run down, it is forgotten, it is very much the middle of nowhere. And it's this extraordinary contrast, the New World moving out west towards California, towards the Rocky Mountains, across the prairies, as it were, symbolized by the city of St. Louis, whereas the old world, you look out east, and you're looking out over East St. Louis, and it's really a city in depression. Well, I suppose the arch was meant to suggest the new life, the way forward, the opening up of the West, another symbol of hope and promise after the Second World War. So, as I say, it's made of reinforced concrete. You enter it through, go down into the shadows there, into the ground, and then you get in one of these capsules. And you're probably wondering, how high is this arch? Any ideas? Okay, hands up if you think it's 152 meters. No. Hands up if you think it's 162. 172. Not many hands here. Up means, don't sort of put it on your shoulder. It's up here. 172. 172 meters. 182. 92. Okay, let's say who thinks it's 212? Any big guys here? Well, I've never met such a group of sleepy students for a long time. It's 192 meters. Who thought it was that? Okay, give me your names, and I'll make sure you pass. Staying with Saarinen, looking at buildings that are different, that show adventure perhaps, that show imagination, that show a different way of dealing with an old problem. This is quite simply an auditorium. But again, it's an architecture of expression, of movement, of vitality, reinforced concrete. It's at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's the Kresge Auditorium. And again, it's an architecture which is to do with, I suppose, structural expression. It doesn't look quite like this, but it looks almost like this. I've put together two photographs to suggest how the architectural form is created. Big arches that spring from corner to corner, with the glazing just filling in the space under the arch. And then within that, the auditorium is created as like a concrete dish or bowl with raked seating. And the structure comes down and becomes very much the architectural expression. And it doesn't, of course, crash into the ground. It stops before the ground. There's a point of tension there where it comes together and then sits on a little plinth that is placed, I think, rather nicely in the middle of a flower bed. So presumably you can get flowers growing up and around the structural starting point. And when you go inside, you're very much aware of the roof, as you were inside the JFK building, the Trans World Airlines terminal building. You're aware of the architecture enveloping you. And you can see just on the left of the left-hand picture there, the underside of the seating structure for the auditorium. Architecture of expression, architecture of movement, architecture of form, I suppose. This is a guy called William Pereira, who was a California, Los Angeles architect. We're moving across the country to Los Angeles International Airport. And this is the old conning tower, the old control tower. It's not just a tower. It is, again, something that looks sort of space age, that looks different, that looks imaginative. It's now a restaurant. And, well, I could have got out of the car, but since I was in what was essentially a freeway zipping around the airport, it wasn't a very good idea, but I managed to stop for enough time to take a picture before I got rear-ended, which didn't happen. But it's, you know, this stuff. We're going on an aeroplane. Aeroplane travel was exciting. It was new. All of you must have been on, well, maybe the British guys haven't been on an aeroplane. All you guys from China must have been in an aeroplane, because you wouldn't have come here on a boat. So airplane travel was exciting. When I was a child, because I'm of this age, you know, you put on smart clothes to travel. You didn't go in your jeans with holes in it or baggy shorts. You know, airplane travel was elegant. The stewardesses and stewards who served you were beautifully dressed. The captain would salute you. You know, it was high-class living. And the airport was all part of that. And the image of the architecture was part of that too. William Pereira, an architect of considerable ability, and here's another of his sort of expressive buildings. This is in University of California, San Diego, the bottom end of California near the Mexican border. This is the library building, which, well, it says Central Library. But you can see again he's used in structure. It's an architecture of structural expression, a series of trees, I suppose, branches that step out, and the platforms are all supported within. This is, again, how can one say it, an architecture of hope, an architecture of future thinking. Okay, it's 1970, the war's been over 25 years, but nevertheless, it's still out there. It's pushing the boundaries. It's been developed a little. I think some of the sense of expression of the building has been lost, particularly in around the entrance there. But it's still worth looking at. Going back to the East Coast, in New York, we find this, the architecture of Mies van der Rohe, a sort of classicism, a formal architecture, an architecture of minimal expression. The expression, well, sorry, I'm using the word doubly here, an architecture of minimal expression, meaning it doesn't have a lot of extraneous parts. It's not an architecture of structural form. It's really a glass box that is held up with an invisible frame on the inside. It's an architecture which is reductivist, that is taken right back to the simplest form. And those previous buildings are not like that. They're much more expressive. This is a very pure form. And it is Mies who, as you will know, coined the expression less is more. He built this with Philip Johnson because he didn't have a license to practice in New York. Philip Johnson did. But the Seagram building, built for the Canadian Whiskey Company, is really perhaps the most perfect example of the less is more ideology. And there's more to it than just less, if you can follow me. The windows are not just glass, well, they are glass, of course, but they're bronze-tinted glass, so there's a richness to it in the color. If you look at Mies van der Rohe's earlier buildings, such as the Tugendhat House of 1931-32, or the Barcelona Pavilion of 1929, you'll see in there the richness of materials that he uses to, in a way, offset the lack of decorative form. It's not just a wall he will have there, but it's a wall of onyx through which light shines. Onyx is a translucent stone. And in the same way here, it's not just window glass, it is bronze-tinted window glass that gives the building this iridescent quality. Philip Johnson, being an architect with a New York license, continues to build in New York. Again, a building of classical proportions, of classical reference, yet devoid of detail, reduced right back to its simplest forms of a colonnade and a balcony running across. The columns are in pairs, so it has a syncopated rhythm. Small gap, large gap, small gap, large gap, and so on. But it's an architecture devoid of detail. It is an architecture where less, in the Miesian sense, represents more. And then you ask, well, what is the architecture? What's the building? It's the New York State Theatre. It's the Lincoln Center. It's the architecture that is used by the wealthy, by New York society, by people who go to the theatre or the opera or the concert. It's an architecture that makes public space, but it is an empty public space, except for a fountain. It's an architecture that is for everybody, but on the other hand, is not used by everybody, because the greater majority of the people in New York would not be able to afford to go here. It's not their seen man. So in this way, this sort of reductivist architecture of less is also an architecture which removes itself from the popular understanding, and it makes itself less available to the public. Put that aside, because we'll come back to this less is more notion. I want to introduce to you another American architect of this time, who actually is Chinese, You Ming-pei. He was born in China. He came over to America, studied architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and stayed in America ever since. Now, you might look at all this and say, well, which one is You Ming-pei? The Christian Science Center is this one here, running along there. And if it looks familiar, as it possibly might, it's because it is, in a sense, very derivative. It's not just that long building, it's also this tower structure that we see in the foreground in the left-hand picture. Quite articulate, quite varied in form. It is not so much an architecture of structural expression or an architecture of less is more, but what at the time, or what more recently I guess we call a plastic architecture, an architecture of plastic form, a sculptural architecture. And you can see that in the curved canopy of the roof. It has classical, traditional, no, I don't want to say traditional, it has classical references in the colonnade and the repetition of form all the way down the side in the rounded arch that cuts through the colonnade. It's not just reduced to minimal forms as a Mies building might be. It's not like a Saarinen building where you get sort of structural excitement going on. It is something somewhat more solid, but at the same time still full of movement. And if you're wondering where its provenance is, it's very clearly in Le Corbusier, the National Assembly building in Chandigarh, for instance. Not just in the roof form, not just in the fins, the vertical walls with the holes sliced through, but also in the positioning of water in front of the building to reflect, as well as to cool the internal spaces. So we have now another theme, another idea coming through. We've had sort of structural expression, we've had architecture of movement, we've had architecture which is less because that is more. We have architecture now which is influenced from Europe, or particularly from Le Corbusier, a plastic architecture. And I don't mean the material plastic, I mean in terms of forming something. And it's his company that also built the John Hancock Tower, which you saw in the first lecture of my series. You saw that picture before. The glass tower that is in the right-hand picture, somewhat difficult to see because it reflects everything that's around it. But anyway, there it is, cutting through the frame of the picture, just in from the right-hand corner. And his colleague, Henry Cobb, was the architect responsible for that. What is this sort of architecture? It's another type of architecture. It's not any of those other categories that we've seen before. It's one that is somewhat to do with context. By using the mirror wall, one can reflect the context. Therefore, the architecture, on the one hand, disappears. On the other hand, becomes completely part of its surroundings. I can't now remember when Norman Foster did the Willis Faber Dumas building in Ipswich, but that was probably the first example of this sort of architecture in England, where you have a curved building with a mirrored wall, which makes the building disappear into the context of the old town in which it was located. Anyway, you know, there it is. Of course, when you're looking up, it's blue because it reflects the sky. But when you're looking at it from a high level, such as the right-hand photograph, then it reflects the ground and changes its appearance altogether. The John Hancock Tower, named after John Hancock. Have you ever heard the expression, put your John Hancock here? Hey man, put your John Hancock here. It means put your signature here. John Hancock signed the American Declaration of Independence, the biggest signature, the one right in the middle. There's John Hancock. Stick your John Hancock here. And this, of course, raises another question. Can you guess what it is? No? Right, shall we try again? This is called participation. All right, 200 meters. Who thinks it's 200 meters? This man here, this lady down here, nobody else. It's 240. You thought you were going to have a chance, didn't you? But no, 240 meters. How high is my tower? 240 meters. Put your John Hancock here. You might be asked this question in a quiz. Yeoming-Pei, enormously successful. I think one of his nicest buildings. We're moving on in time now, in a sense, from the post-war era into the 70s. This is still prehistory from your point of view, but nevertheless, the East Wing addition to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Very simple, very sculptural, very elegant, very sharp in every sense of the word. This corner here, you know, you could almost cut your finger on it. It's like a knife blade. And it's I think, a very beautiful building. Built with concrete frame and finished in stone. In the same way, another building of very expressive form, Carman McKinnell and Knowles, City Hall in Boston. If you've had lectures, no, you wouldn't have. Barnabas didn't lecture this lot. Next week. Are you getting Barnabas next week?
No, I'll do
Oh, we've got Patrick doing brutalism next week. Our colleague Barnabas Corder, Mr. Brutalist Corder, would talk about something like this. This is the City Hall, Boston, designed by a British architect. Now, which one was he? He wasn't Corman. McKinnell. He came from Manchester, but he was part of this team that won a competition to build the City Hall in Boston. And we get this, I think, quite extraordinary building, which is really very European in its form. It shows the influence of Le Corbusier, and I'll show you a picture to explain that in a minute. But it's, you know, falls into that same grouping or that same camp as the Christian Science building in Boston, the one by Yeoming-Pei, an architecture that's looking towards Europe, or if you like, coming from Europe. There's the influence, the couvent, or monastery, of La Tourette by Le Corbusier, or the monk's cells, all those little rooms. And you can see how that is expressed again in the facade of the City Hall there in Boston. The big, massive architecture raised up on thin piers or thin walls in both cases. The open space underneath, light coming through, space coming through or going through. And you go inside the building, and it's again a building where the sculptural form is taken through to the inside. This is the sort of thing one does with reinforced concrete. It's not like so much you see going up nowadays, where the frame disappears somewhere into the cladding, and it's just a glass envelope around the outside. The sculptural form of the exterior is still to be experienced as you move inside. The massing, the modulation, the plasticity of the building is all there. Looking across the foyer in the top photograph on the left, looking at the underside of the council chamber, where you get the impression of the seats, of the step seating shown in the ceiling in a sort of negative way down here. So those are the steps or the seats on which the city councillors are sitting, the representatives. You know, this building shows its form internally, externally, and even in an inverted way. You can sense what goes on within a closed space by looking at the shape of it from the outside. You can see the building there on the right-hand side of the picture, just the corner of it. And then there's this great plaza. And on the other side, buildings by Paul Rudolph, another architect of enormous verve and a great one for sort of plastic form in his building. He was Dean of Architecture at Yale University. And this is, coming back to J.F. Kennedy, we've got the John F. Kennedy Federal Building, Government Center, Boston. And it's big, and it's powerful, and it's impressive. But it's also, I think, quite humane. It has open space, it has greenery, it has a scale that is, in places, of a human scale. So one doesn't feel this is a naked plaza with some vast concrete structure. It's also a space that is, as I say, humane, that is usable, that is welcoming. With this type of architecture, this poured concrete architecture, where you get modulated forms, repetition of columns, repetition of windows, so much of the effect of the building is to do with light and shade, to do with chiaroscuro, as the Italians say about painting. And I think it's very apparent in the top right-hand photograph there, where the colonnade stretches along and you get all the dark interstices between the columns. You also get it in the window patterning on the tall tower. So we come back to John Fitzgerald Kennedy sitting on the right. You've seen this picture before. Last time it was in color. And the federal building now bears his name. And there's a conversation going on here. What do you think they're saying? Does anyone read Russian? Nobody reads Russian. I mean, I can't do Chinese. I can do Russian. Okay, well, the answer will be lost on you. Now, this is the space race, isn't it? I tried to explain some of that to you, the Cold War, the standoff. You know, the alpha males, the testosterone. What's he saying? Right, we will move on. So the 1950s, the 60s, into the 70s, we get this architecture of power, this architecture of expression, corporate identity, many ways of describing it. And there was in St. Louis, and we've been to St. Louis before, I can't see the arch here, East St. Louis at the top of the picture, that really awful suburb in Illinois, across the river, St. Louis, main city, down here. We get a housing scheme by an American architect, Minoru Yamasaki, called Pruitt-Igoe. And this became, in a very strange and indeed unfortunate way, symptomatic of modernism. Modernism from when does it start? I don't know. 1910, 1920, whatever you think is modernism. It crescendoed through the 20s, through the 30s, into the post-war years. The architecture of modernism, the architecture of the international style. And it found itself being used in great housing schemes like this by the 1950s, by which time much of the social welfare, the hope of that sort of architecture, the hope for better life, the social welfare the architecture represented, had somehow got lost. So this became a symbol, really, of the failure of modern architecture, the failure of the modern movement in architecture, where you get slab blocks just stacking across the landscape. This was a vertical slum, as opposed to the horizontal slum that it was meant to have replaced. And in 1972 it was demolished. And if you want to sort of be romantic about it, this was the date that modern architecture died. the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe scheme has been put forward as the moment when modernism was no longer valid. And there it was being ripped down. Well, for many people it had died long before then. For many people it continued to live. Late modernism, Foster, Rogers, whatever. But nevertheless, this is held up as by people like Charles Jenks, architectural writer, commentator, and so on, as really the moment modernism died in architecture. 1972. Okay, so what was happening? Why was modernism dying? Because a few years earlier, 1966, 6 years before, this book was published by a man called Robert Venturi. I say, and it's hardly an original comment, that there were really two important architectural books in the 20th century. One was by Le Corbusier. It was called Vers une architecture moderne, or Towards a Modern Architecture, or Towards a New Architecture, I should say. In the English translation, 1923, it was first published. And the second book was this one, 1966. They're 40 years apart, and they show completely opposite arguments. They contain completely opposite arguments. One is for modernism, the other is for, if you like, post-modernism, the architecture that came after modernism. And what he's arguing for is complexity, and he's arguing for contradiction. And we get that in the illustrations, in the choice of architecture that he uses to represent an alternative to modernism. What is complex and what is contradictory? If you look at top right, Jasper Johns' paintings of the American flag, the Stars and Stripes. It's not just one flag, it is three that are overlaid upon each other. And you look at it, and then you have to look again because you don't quite get it. It looks slightly odd. It is complex. It is also contradictory. The lines that should be horizontal, well, they are horizontal, but they don't join up. There's a break in it somehow. You look at this one here, Thomas Jefferson's buildings at University of of Virginia in Charlottesville, where you get a portico, a classical portico built 1806, with a colonnade running not up to it, but actually sort of running through it underneath. You get one layer of architecture, these four big columns and the pediment, another layer of architecture, these paired columns, the entablature, and it continues and emerges the other side. You don't really expect this. You don't usually get one type of architecture with another type cutting through underneath. This is Sir John Vanbrugh, British architect from the 17th century or early 18th century. Again, an architecture of vast scale, of mass, of classical forms on the one hand, the portico, the pediment, but on the other hand, there's this strange sort of, is that a window or what is it? This way of taking an architectural language and subverting it. This is what Robert Venturi is promoting as both complex and contradictory. And this is what he felt architecture should be doing. He was completely tired of the simplicity, if you like, of modern architecture. And this building here is the house that he designed for his mother, whose name was Vanna Venturi. It's called the Vanna Venturi House. It's illustrated in the book, as you might be able to tell from the format. And if you look at the top left-hand picture, which I dare say is a bit small, it is a classical pediment. It is a triangulated form, like this triangle up here, like this one down here. But it becomes the whole house. And it is split down the middle. Well, you can do that with triangular pediments. I'm wondering if there's a picture of one up here. There isn't. But if you look at the top left-hand picture, you can see that the triangle has been split down the middle, and that's okay. And it's got a square opening underneath. Well, that's sort of okay, the entrance. Yet it goes a bit strange after that. There's a long horizontal window to the right and a square window cut into the wall off in the other corner to the left. So he's taking a regular classical elevation and starting to break it up and do strange things with it. Now, you might think, well, this is all very ordinary. You've seen this before. But this is 1966. This is 52 years ago. And this stuff was fairly new and unexpected at this point. The bottom photograph on the left shows the other side of the house. And you can maybe just make out, behind the trees, a semicircular window with vertical supports going through it. That is a Diocletian window, a window from the Palace of Diocletian in the Yugoslav city of Split or Spalatro. Is it in Yugoslavia now? They've changed the names of all those countries. I can't keep up. But anyway, Diocletian Palace in Spalatro or Split, which was always seen as a source for classical architecture. Robert Adam, the great 18th century Scottish architect, traveled there and did a big, big book on the Palace of Diocletian. And this is where the semicircular window with the two vertical supports comes from, the two vertical mullions. So Venturi is saying, take the classical language and subvert it. Do things that are different, that are interesting. Okay, so there's the house. You can see more clearly now what I was getting at. The triangular pediment that is split. The long window on one side, completely imbalanced by the square window on the other side, and then a funny little square window sort of just to the left of the entrance. Is that an arch over the entrance, or is it a lintel, a horizontal lintel, a semicircular arch? It doesn't really matter, but they are classical references that are drawn into the elevation and almost literally drawn on the building as opposed to being three-dimensional expressions. And then the bottom picture shows the Diocletian window, and again a series of totally domestic scale windows down here. Now this could be a suburban house. That could be the sitting room window, which of course it is, but it's sort of unexpected. It's taking the ordinary and raising it to a level of architectural expression which is not expected. So with complexity and with contradiction, one could offset the banality of modern architecture. Mises' expression, less is more, Venturi said, less is boring. So you do more. You don't do less, you do more. You add layers of interest, and you make it complex, and you make it contradictory. As if that wasn't quite enough for people to get their minds around, 11 years later, he did a book called Learning from Las Vegas. If you've been to Las Vegas in Nevada, here's a city, in a sense, out of control architecturally. Anything goes, anything happens. And it's a city that is perceived at the scale of the automobile moving through it and moving, at a sort of fairly constant speed, 30 miles an hour, or later 55 miles an hour if you're just on the edge of town. So you get things that are done on a big scale, bombastic, such as Tanya up there. It's no good having a poster this wide. You'll never see it from your car. So you do something that's, 20 meters wide and 10 meters high, so you can see it. And this is more likely to cause a crash than anything if you think about it. Oh my God, what was that? Wham. Okay, so here you are, driving through this city. And it's an architecture that is tuned to the automobile, because the automobile is how American society moves. If there's going to be a sort of genetic development in American societies, people won't have legs because they spend their whole times in their cars. Now, that's not totally true, but think about it. America is very much a car society. So your architecture's got to be attuned to the car society. So what do you have? You've got, on the right, you either have a big sign with a little building, or you get a building as a sign. You get you're driving along. Here's a big, big sign that says W. What might it be? It says Colonel Sanders, or it says McDonald's, or it says any of these other instant food places, fast food joints. And then there's a shed where they serve the stuff. The shed is irrelevant. The sign is the architecture. Or you can get the building as the sign. The building can say, look, here we are. This is us. This is, in this case, a duck. We do duck sandwiches. I don't know what they are. But, you know, the building is the sign there. This is an architecture of signs, of sign language, of semiology. And this became all terribly popular in the 1970s. You get this theory developing from the book that a building can either be a duck or a decorated shed. You've seen the two examples. So this is the building as a duck. There's the highway with the car. I'm not quite sure what model it is, but it is cruising along. And you get the building that is what it says it is. It's a duck. You know, a duck is a duck. It's got a beak. It goes quack. It's got wings. It's got flippers on its feet. You know, it looks like what it looks like because it does what it do. And that's exactly what that is. The alternative is the decorated shed. It's just a shed. A garden shed, a shed, industrial shed. Doesn't matter. And it's got a big sign on the outside saying eat. So that shed is a shed where you eat. If it said bank, B-A-N-K, it would be a shed where you go for your money. If it said fashion, it would be a shed where you go for your clothes. It doesn't really matter. It's to do with signage. Behind the frilly facade, it's the same old box. So architecture is reduced now to two opposites. The architecture of the duck, the building that is what it says it is, because it looks like it, and the building of the decorated shed that actually has its function written on the outside. This is the duck. Well, actually, it's a dinosaur. I couldn't find you a duck, but it's pretty good, isn't it? Dinny the dinosaur and Mr. Rex at Cabazon in California. Concrete biomorphic buildings. If you were driving from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, or should you drive from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, you'd go past these guys, Dinny the dinosaur and Mr. Rex. That's Mr. Rex and that's Dinny. And I always liked to stop there because it was about 3/4 of the way to Palm Springs, and it was a long straight road, and it was hot, and it was boring. And they had this fantastic diner there. If you've ever been to a sort of Wild West diner, this was it. It was a shed. It probably said food on the outside. And you go inside, this completely unreal world. Timber-lined, rough timber-lined interior, full of all sorts of things on the walls, like bows and arrows and you know, other bits of native, as it were, American native insignia. And they served fantastic pancakes, American pancakes. And it was a great joy for me, coming from this boring country, to go and get good American pancakes for breakfast, particularly here with Dinny the dinosaur and Rex. But they've closed it. So, you know, it's going to be difficult now to pull off the freeway just to see these two concrete guys, because I've spent a lot of time looking at them already. But this is the duck, the building that is what it says it is. You can go inside Dinny the dinosaur. You go in at the tail somewhere, and you can see he's got a window, or she's got a window in her left rear haunch. If you ever want to get inside a dinosaur. It's a decorated shed. I came across this sort of by accident in Chicago. I was looking for some building, and I suddenly saw this and thought, WTF. And this is extraordinary. I've never seen this building before. And I walked up to it and realized, in fact, the whole thing was painted. This is a painted building. It's a brick, flat brick facade. Everything you're looking at in that picture has been applied with paint. And perspectives are a little bit strange. You get these great here. And God, I can't remember who that is. Root, yes. Burnham and Root, the American firm who built much of the Chicago Exposition buildings. So that's Mr. Root, trying to think of his first name. They're painted on there, but they're painted like they are bas-reliefs. And, you know, there's nothing to this. It is a building that says architecture, but the architecture's all painted on. It's a trompe-l'oeil in every possible sense. Richard Haas, 1981. It's holding up well. So you put the duck and you put the decorated shed together, if you want a sort of contrast here. On the left, I would say that was a duck. We've seen this building already. This is Pereira's. It's now a restaurant. It was the conning tower at Los Angeles International Airport. And, you know, it's a building that sort of is there because it is there and it does what it does. It lets people look out. It's a conning tower. And the other one, the decorated shed, well, it is quite literally a shed. Randy's Donuts, really good donuts. And you can pull off the freeway just 2 stops or so before you go to the airport, and there's Randy's Donuts. And how do you know it's a donut building? Because it's got a dirty great donut on the roof. If it had a shoe on the roof, what would you buy there? A shoe, or a pair of shoes. So, decorated shed. I'd like to think that the donut revolved, but it doesn't. More the shame. So we find ourselves now in the world of postmodern architecture. It seemed to become a particularly American fascination. And these are the usual suspects, group of criminals. You can read the names. Top row from left, Michael Graves, Cesar Pelli, Charles Guathmy, Peter Eisenman. Bottom row, Frank Gehry, Charles Moore, Philip Johnson, and a sphere, Stanley Tigerman and Bob Stern. What's Philip Johnson doing with a sphere? I don't know, but there was an early photograph of Bob Dylan when he was sort of very young and enigmatic and nobody quite knew what he was about. And he was photographed holding a light bulb, not plugged in, just a light bulb, you know, emanation of light, of knowledge, whatever. Maybe the sphere suggests that. Well, I'm going to show you pictures by some of these guys, but not quite all of them. And one might question whether Frank Gehry is really a postmodern architect. He's sort of gone off on his own trajectory. Charles Moore, I think, certainly. Philip Johnson, he called himself the whore of architecture. You know, he'd sell himself to any style. We've seen him doing less is more with Mies van der Rohe. But now he's all Mr. Postmodern. Stanley Tigerman, Bob Stern, they all sort of into postmodernism. Peter Eisenman, a man I totally fail to understand. I mean, anybody who designs a house with a slot between the 2 beds on the first floor, so you sort of fall through it as you get out of bed, beats me. Guathmy, Seagull, they tended to do rather Corbusian buildings. Cesar Pelli, who did Canary Wharf in the City of London, and the Pacific Design Center in Los Angeles, if you know that. And Michael Graves, he's sort of interesting. When you went to work for Michael Graves' office, you were given a set of colored crayons. You could only use those colors. And when I was teaching in California, this sort of architecture didn't go down well. So one of my colleagues had, you know, buttons or badges made up saying, "We don't dig graves." Get it? We don't dig. I don't think they get anything. Oh, what have we got? Philip Johnson, okay? The AT&T building, the American Telephone and Telegraph building. What is that? It's a tower block. But it's not like the Seagram building. It's suddenly expressive. It's suddenly got decoration. It has a broken pediment at the top. It has classicism wrapped into it. So it's a piece of postmodern classicism. Classical architecture became part of the vocabulary of the postmodern people. More classical architecture. This is the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans by Charles Moore. Down here. It's really interesting. He sort of moved across various styles. He did some really nice stuff. I love that building because it's so sort of wacky. It's a stage set. It has the map of Italy in the stonework on the ground. The water is drained out at the moment, but you're meant to be able to see the water around the map of Italy. It's in the Italian quarter of New Orleans, and the screen walls behind suggest, of course, Italian architecture. Michael Graves, the Portlandia building in Portland, Oregon. Michael Graves' architecture was about that thick. It was as thick as the skin on the building. If you took the skin off that building, you just have a box. You could almost say it's painted on. It isn't. But, nevertheless, his architecture is an architecture of surface, applied architecture, if you like. But these are all classical. They're all using classical vocabulary, classical forms, to make up the architectural decoration. And this is Robert Stern. This is in Boston. It's a office building just behind the Trinity Church, where we started this lecture program a few weeks ago, just beside the IMP building. And you can't quite make out, but there's the bottom layer of that building, where it's brickwork, has got classical columns and there are classical urns on it. Classicism is an easy number if you're a postmodernist. Robert Venturi, of course, was a postmodernist. He was the guy who, in a sense, set the whole thing going. One of the things about postmodernism is that it can be somewhat flippant. It can have jokes. So this is Benjamin Franklin's house. Benjamin Franklin, American president, signer of the independence, of the Declaration of Independence. Well, of course, his house had vanished years ago, but it's as a monument to him. They recreated the outline of his house. He has drawn the house in steel in 3 dimensions in this open space. And, well, sort of, what does one say? You know, there it is, the Ben Franklin house in Franklin Court. It's what you say, what you call a one-liner. You know, do you get the joke? Yes. Laugh? Yes. Okay. Move on to the next thing. It is something that lacks substance, but is perhaps amusing. Venturi did a number of buildings at Princeton University, because he taught there. And we start to look at them, and you can see these classical features coming in. You've got to look, in a sense, quite hard to be able to work it out. But much of it is to do with this notion of a 2-dimensional expression in a 3-dimensional form. Fairly easy to spot is the semicircular window there, with the 2 verticals. That's the Diocletian window, which I mentioned. Here, those white pieces, these are, of course, classical keystones. They don't do anything. There's a big steel beam behind there, no doubt, holding it all up. Something's got to support the brickwork above that long glazed wall. But there is this sort of notion of classicism in the use of a form that suggests a keystone, that something has been sliced through, like on a meat slicer in the delicatessen. In the same way as here on this sundial, if you look at the top there, the outline of the top of the sundial of this thing is of a piece of classical molding or entablature that's just been sliced off. Move down to the far end of the elevation and you get a series of geometric shapes. You get triangles, you get circles, another thing that looks a bit like a keystone, and you get some sort of lozenge shapes. These, again, are what you might call Platonic shapes. Corbusier did them in 3 dimensions, but here the whole thing's reduced to an architecture of 2 dimensions of surface and a simple geometric form like a circle or like a rectangle, or square, I should say, or like a triangle is what you see there. Isosceles triangles and equilateral triangles. The same building. You can see again in the end there, the way it wraps around. It's an architecture of skin. It doesn't have any depth to it. It's an architecture, if you like, of decoration. What is it? A decorated shed in that sense. Moving across the campus to the Lewis Thomas Laboratory, it looks like it's got a woven facade of I don't know, some sort of carpeting wrapped around the building. This this is brickwork. But, again, it's sort of saying we're not brickwork, we're something else. We're just surface decoration. We're there to keep the building warm. And behind that, there's a suggestion of structure, as you can see the columns running through. The woven facade, Harris Tweed in architecture. And then you get the arches. I wonder what they're doing. They're obviously not supporting. They must be hanging because there's no columns. Semicircular one, then an ogival, sort of Islamic arch, and then you get another semicircular one. But, what's the support? Where's the underside of the arch? Where's the column? It's not there. And it says again that this is an architecture applied to a building. This is not the architecture of the building. This is surface. This is decoration. Remember the modern movement band decoration. Here it is in full flood. Another of his buildings at Princeton, Bentheim Hall. Well, you might look at this and say, well, that's sort of fairly straightforward. This entrance here, it's got the name, it's got a few windows, it's got a pediment. That's sort of okay. But then if you look carefully, just see the shadow, you can actually tell, and you can looking at this picture, that sort of classical entrance, albeit reduced to a bit like 2 dimensions, is actually bent. The 3 windows on the left are in one plane. The one window on the right is at an angle to it. It bends. Is this a joke? What's the name of the building? Bend. I don't know. You can read into this sort of stuff whatever you want to, as far as I can see. But maybe it is quite simply, Mr. Bentheim, okay, we'll bend your building. And so it goes. There's more classical details beyond the bicycles there in those columns. They've been sliced through like they're off a loaf of bread. Here, that's just behind the bicycles. You have an entablature running along, or a string course perhaps, in a dark granite. And it doesn't go round the corner, it's just sliced, like Mother's Pride. An architecture of production line of surface. Michael Graves, we saw this one briefly, the Portlandia building. Where's the classical architecture in it? It's in this triangulated sort of keystone effect. It's in these possible flutings that might be a column, whatever's on the top of it, some sort of capital or block. Maybe they're twinned columns with a common capital. I don't really know. But, it is an architecture that suggests classical provenance. It says something about historical forms. But it's nevertheless an architecture that is just as thick as the material stuck on the outside of the building. Go round the corner and, well, one side it's still got that. The other side, it's got a ribbon going around it. It's sort of tied in like a parcel you might get from the department store that's been wrapped up specially as a gift wrap, a gift wrap building. What is this band of light blue decoration around the top of that elevation doing? I don't know. But there are some things about Michael Graves' architecture that in a way is quite charming. This is a little library at San Juan Capistrano in Southern California. This is where the swallows first come, and it's the sign that spring is on the way when the swallows are found at San Juan Capistrano. This is, to some extent, the architecture of Southern California. White stucco walls, red clay tile roofs, the architecture of the hacienda, that's a Spanish word for a sort of farmhouse, and the architecture of the missions, the churches you get down there. And he's taken this architecture and he's reduced it, simplified it, and turned it into something that is actually rather akin to a sort of toy town architecture. It's not without charm, but is it with substance? I don't know. I've been there a few times, and these photographs jump back and forth between different visits. So you might find there's vegetation on the roof, or you might find there's not, depending on which visit it was. We've got a pediment over the entrance. Here's the entrance here. A pediment. This is a semicircular pediment, segmental pediment. That's absolutely fine. You can have that. It's on columns. But if you look at it, it's actually become an arbor. It's become a piece of trellis work, lightweight timber to take plants. It's, you know, the columns have sort of disappeared. The little brown stubs of columns disappeared into these great white shafts there. So again, the classicism is there, but it's changed, it's subsumed, it's different. View into the entrance there, and then into the courtyard. Here you see the trees are tall, or they're not so tall. I actually think this was the earlier photograph. I'm sure it is. And then next time I went back, the trees had been reduced in size. I think the problem was they might fall over, and the building was terribly thin. It's just timber frame with stucco on the outside, so if a tree hit that wall, it would make a big hole. But a nice little courtyard with a fountain, and I think the fountain's changed as well. The later fountain's got 3 stages, the earlier fountain's got 2 stages. Maybe they watered it and it grew. That's a joke, doesn't matter. You go inside, and you know, this is sort of quite nice, really. A long corridor between the book stacks, a nice timber roof, wall lights, use of colour. This is the Michael Graves restricted range of colour. A hallway outside a lecture theatre, which is where the double doors are. Looking up into the roof of the hallway, you get this sort of stuff. It's all nicely thought through. It's nicely done. It has its charm, but does it have its substance? Philip Johnson, remember the guy with the sphere in his hand, the architecture, the whore of architecture? Well, we're doing a apartment building here, a resident office building, 1001 Fifth Avenue, New York, and we've got to give it a facade. So in this picture, it looks absolutely sort of okay, but you come around the side, and of course, there's the joke. It isn't really okay at all. It's a facade that rises up just as a screen, and you can actually see the supports that hold it in place. It is a stage set. It is a film set. It's like a piece of the Wild West they would build in Hollywood. Is that architecture, or is that a joke? Well, it's postmodernism. And we come back to this, the AT&T building. Really the first of the high-rise postmodern jokes. What's this based upon? Bit of Chippendale furniture. Turn your wardrobe into a skyscraper. If you're stuck for ideas, just look at the furniture in your student room and use that as the basis of your building. I don't recommend that, really. So you can go in, as one did, as I did, and it's like you're inside a Romanesque church. It's extraordinary. This is the foyer for the elevators, and you go up to the first floor, which is this oculus here. It's a big round window. That's 5 stories up or so within that entrance arch. And that's the lower down level. So that's the entrance foyer, 2 shots of the same thing. But you take the lift up to that level with the round oculus. But this looks like a Romanesque church. Yet this is a steel building. I mean, what is going on here? The first steel-framed Romanesque church. And that's at the upper level. And it's not just done in any old material. This is done in travertine marble. This is serious stuff. This is not cheap. How many floors of the building? Heavens. And here's another one I showed you briefly. Philip Johnson, 550. Oh, I said this was Bob Stern. It isn't. It's Philip Johnson. That one's Philip Johnson. The red one to the left is Bob Stern. 550 Bolston Street. What is this? It's a giant conservatory. It's the Crystal Palace from London, 1851. It is full of historic illusion, and it's got flower pots along the top. Or are these funeral urns? I don't really know. I mean, you could do a steel building with glass panels, such as the one behind, which is the John Hancock over here. Or you can deck it out in some decorative guise. Okay, so Bob Stern, the red one in the foreground. What does one make of that? Why do you need to put this on the front? Why do you need to put a colonnade? Why do you need to put these urns on the front? To make the building look more expensive? To be able to sell the ground, the leases for each floor at inflated prices? Quite possibly. I went to a series of lectures in 1984 at the Royal Institute of British Architects. 85, just before I went to go and teach in California. And it was an American postmodern architecture, essentially. And Bob Stern was there, so I went up to him afterwards and said, oh, you know, you showed a building, drawings for a building in La Jolla in California. And I knew I was going to be near La Jolla. I said, you know, if I went to look at the building, is it finished yet? And he said, yes, we've finished the building, we haven't put the architecture on yet. So where's the building and where's the architecture? Should they not be the same thing? Do you put architecture onto a building? When I went to work in Leeds University in 2000, I was in the School of Civil and Structural Engineering, and they didn't really want an architect there. At least they did, because they appointed me, but they weren't quite sure what architects did. They said, can you do some sketches? And I said, yeah, we do sketches, you know. They're all engineers. And I had to work with this engineer who clearly resented having an architect running what he thought was his program. And he said to me, you know, architects, he said it in his Leeds accent. Anyone from Leeds here? Can you do a Leeds accent for me? He said architects put frilly bits on when engineers finished. It's the same, you see. The architect just puts on the frilly bits. I sorted him out. Frank Gehry, he was in this list of criminals, wasn't he? He was on the left bottom. You've heard of Frank Gehry. His architecture's gone through all sorts of changes. And I think some of his best stuff was his earlier stuff. And it often is the case. If you want to really study an architect, look at what they did when they were young, when they were brave, when they had no inhibitions. That's where the good stuff is. Norman Foster's gone really boring recently. It's tedious. But look at the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. Rogers is better, but look at the Pompidou. You know, that's where the architecture really is. So Frank Gehry, 1984, the Norton House in Venice, California. This is the boardwalk down here. It's concrete. It's the boardwalk. There's the sand. There's the sea. You know, these houses go right the way down the coast. And what's he done is build, this is not him, it's not this one. It's this one here with the box. He's built this bit of seaside architecture. And Mr. Norton was a screenwriter who had previously, as a young man, been a lifeguard. So he's built this guy a lifeguard station, because along the coast you get these boxes where the lifeguards sit and they look out to see people in distress. And he was a screenwriter, so he wanted a room in which to write his screen scripts, and he could sort of fantasize about being a bronzed lifeguard at the same time. So he's up there at the top of this pole in that box. And the house steps up behind, and there are levels and so on. And then Frank decided it needed a bit of something in the forecourt, so he built a Stonehenge, a wood henge, some primitive structure, which is actually done in concrete. But don't worry about it. And you know, it's there. It's weird. It's expressive. It is of the place. Notice the house to the right. You know, with its crossed oars and its fishing net, and there's the fishing nets down here, and it's life-felt. I mean, this is absolutely the architecture of the seaside, and I think this is fabulous. This is equally wacky. But I think later photographs will show you some changes. Oh, no, I don't have a later photograph. I do have some that show that the house to the right has become a sort of glass box and is absolutely horrendous. But that's sort of fun. And the Chiat Day building, this is an advertising agency, again in Venice, California. Venice is part of Los Angeles, it's on the coast. What do you do when you're trying to design a building that will attract people's attention? Well, you've got three parts. You've got the, whatever part that is, studio or something. You've got this part here, which seems to be the offices, and you've got the entrance. How do I do an entrance? How do I link up these buildings? And the story is there was a pair of binoculars in the office, and they had this model, and somebody went, "Oh, Frank, why don't you do this?" and put the binoculars on the model. Man, that's one hell of an idea. So we get building as binoculars. It's not quite as simple as that. There's an artist called Klaus Oldenburg, who was a great friend of Frank's, who had actually worked with him on some earlier buildings. And the ideas that Klaus Oldenburg had was to take the ordinary, the everyday object, whether it be a hamburger or a Swiss Army knife, and make it at vast scale. So 4 meter long, 5 meter long Swiss Army knife. You know about this? You know about the Swiss Army knife?
I know about the Swiss.
Have you been in the army?
No.
Oh, you haven't, I've got one of those knives, but I haven't been in the army. And, you know, Klaus Oldenburg made a vast Swiss Army knife with the blades sticking up, you know, and knife blades do. So, a pair of binoculars. What the hell? This building is instantly recognizable. Problem solved. Which one's the Chiat? Oh, it's the one with the binoculars. Got it. Building as duck. What I like doing when I photograph is try to get something completely out of place in the picture. I just love this sign, you know, one way, no parking. It's sort of like pop art. All these pictures I've shown you today and in the previous lectures are my pictures. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of buildings over many years, nevertheless. But if you want to understand buildings, you've got to look at them. The best way to understand them is to draw them, but I'm too impatient and I can't draw well enough to satisfy me. So I take pictures and get pictures. Go back to the same building. Wait till the sun's shining. Think about the picture you're taking. New Orleans, 1984. I went down there after working in Kansas for a year, and they had this thing called the Louisiana World Exposition. And Charles Moore in the Piazza d'Italia, I mentioned that briefly. We had a snapshot of it. It's down here in New Orleans, next to the World's Exposition. So we're going to see both. The entrance to the Piazza d'Italia is through a classical temple-like form. But they're concrete columns, a steel frame, roof-structured pediment, canvas, entablature with the name Piazza d'Italia painted on it. It is and it isn't classical architecture. Obviously it isn't. It's new and it's modern materials. Yet it purports to be. It is postmodern classicism. And then there's this rather curious thing, which actually is a suggestion of an Italian campanile or bell tower. Go to Italian cities, you get bell towers next to the churches. In this country, the bell tower is part of the church mostly. In Italy, it's often separate. And that's what that thing is. It's a bell tower. And it's part of this little complex area called the Piazza d'Italia, the Italian Piazza. There's the campanile. And one thing about this architecture is that it's actually an architecture with no substance. Again, well, you could do this with poured concrete, but this is probably done with a steel frame, timber subframe, and wood and stucco. It's hollow. I mean, you tap the walls and they'll sound hollow. It's an architecture of cut-out forms. And you go into the piazza where as I've said, the map of Italy is depicted in the shape of the water that, well, this should be full of water down here. So this bit here represents the map of Italy down there, with layers of sort of classical architecture behind. But it's an architecture that's been taken over. There's the map. You can sort of make out Italy in there, and the radial curves that make up the black and white pattern on the floor. You've never seen Ionic or Corinthian capitals quite like this. But then, this is postmodern. So you make your Ionic capital out of steel, chrome steel, or stainless steel that is then curved over. Or that's the Ionic one if you're wondering, or your Corinthian one there. And what are those sort of spigots that stick up around the capital? These are water fountains, because the place is full of water, at least it wasn't on the day I went there. But it is full of water. And water spouts out of those spigots. Water pours or dribbles out of the ring that goes around this capital at the top of the column. And those are Doric columns on either side of the arch, again with a ring around it for water. It's very much a water-based type of architecture. And there's the face of the architect, twice. This is Charles Moore. And if he looks like he's been dribbling, he has, because water will come out of his mouth. They turned it off that day, so it was a shame. But, you know, this is a Doric column and a Doric capital. It couldn't be anything else. Yet, at the same time, it isn't, of course, because it's in steel and it's got a ring around it that dribbles water, and it's split down the middle. There you go. He did some interesting things. He needs a nose job, doesn't he? So we go past that and we go into the exposition grounds. And that's what they call the Wonder Wall. You go under this archway and there is Louisiana, the state of Louisiana. It's on the Gulf of Mexico. It's on the bayou. It has alligators. It is subtropical. It has mermaids, and there's Neptune, and it's all fun. It's the pressure release valve for the southern states. New Orleans became really popular when they were building the great dams upriver in the Colorado area, and people would come down to New Orleans on a sort of weekend break or a week-long break and blow their money. Just let it all out. It is a fun city. And so the architecture is an architecture that is clearly temporary, but it's an architecture full of classical allusion, or indeed illusion, but it alludes to classical forms. You can see temple forms, you can see colonnades. You know, this one here is called the Watergate. Where are we? 1982. Yes, but isn't there a joke in there? The Watergate, 1972, the break-in. You know, this is not just the Watergate, this is the Watergate. One is having a go at the Republicans. That's my friend Wade, who lived in New Orleans, and who let me stay with him. There's a pelican there on top of the, whatever that is, the sculptural form. The pelican, the state bird of, was that an eagle? American eagle, might be, I don't know, one bird's the same. So as you look at this, you see the angels with their trumpets.